It's good enough. Latest on continuing series of interviews with prominent historians on history of resistance. Today, I want to welcome Kai Bird, who is a New York Times best-selling author. Book, some of you have read now, called The Good Spy: The Life and Death of Robert Ames. He's also written biographies of famous Americans, including Jimmy Carter, John J. McCloy, George Bundy, and William Bundy. And he's best known to all of you probably as the co-author of American Prometheus, a biography of nuclear scientist Robert Oppenheimer. It was the basis for Christopher Nolan's Oscar-winning film Oppenheimer. As the son of an American Foreign Service officer, Guy grew up in India and the Middle East. He wrote about his childhood in Arab East Jerusalem and crossing the Mandelbaum Gate, coming of age between the Arabs and Israelis. That book and The Good Spy show Kai's intimate understanding of Palestinian affairs and the inner workings of the PLO during the years of its resistance to Israeli occupation. He is now the executive director and distinguished lecturer for Leon Levitard biography at City University. He is, I'm glad to say, he's just completed his upcoming biography of the American fraudster lawyer Roy Cohn, which will be out next year from Scribner. Welcome, Kai. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Charlie, for having me.
No, I want to ask you first, before the students jump in, which they're anxious to do, where your initial understanding of what the Palestinian resistance was and how you came to it and how you came to write about it.
Well, I grew up with it. I grew up with the conflict. My earliest memories are of Jerusalem when I was 5 and 6 years old, and then Beirut and Saudi Arabia and Cairo, and then I attended, actually, when I was in college, I spent my sophomore year in Beirut at AUB. And the year was 1970-71. And 2 weeks after I arrived in September of 70, I was listening to the BBC, and the radio announcer announced that 4 airplanes had been hijacked by the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP. And then the next day, a 5th plane was hijacked, and I was studying Arabic in a little village overlooking the Beirut's international airport, and I could see that plane on the tarmac. And it was there for a while and then took off after being refueled. And a few hours later, I got a phone call and I was told that my girlfriend, my high school girlfriend at the time, was trying to pay me a visit, and she was on that plane and she'd been hijacked. And she was flown to an abandoned airfield in northern Jordan. And she was kept hostage there for 4 days on the plane. And then, as you may know, after 4 days, the Palestinian guerrillas ordered everyone off, and they blew up 3 of the planes that were on the desert tarmac that day. And you can see the picture of it very dramatically of the 3 planes simultaneously being up. So, all my life I've been living with this conflict, which is why many years later I sat down to try to learn more about the history and the context of it. And that's why I wrote this childhood memoir, Crossing Mandelbaum Gate, and then The Good Spy.
Now I'm going to open it up to the students. So we'll start. Who would like to ask the first question? Ali, go ahead.
Uh, Hello, Dr. Bird. I'm Ali Ajouch. I'm a third year computer engineering student. And I wanted to ask you just how much did growing up in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia and Lebanon, uh, and Jerusalem, just how much did it influence not only reason why you wrote it, but your perspectives maybe on the subjects that you wrote on within your book?
Well, it influenced my life a lot. I grew up essentially hearing about the plight of the Palestinian refugees and the conflict, and I was sympathetic. But I should say that, when I came back to America finally, I was 18 years old, to go to college. I never really lived in my own country. So I was a stranger in America. And in college, I met a young woman who became my wife, and she is not only Jewish, but she is the only daughter of two Holocaust survivors, both of her parents from Austria. And so I was compelled to learn a little more about the conflict from the Jewish side of the story. And no, it's extraordinary. My whole life has been absorbed by this terrible conflict. But coming back to The Good Spy, it's an incredible story, and I'd like to explain how I came to write that book. When I was living as a 10-year-old, 11-year-old in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, my next door neighbor was Robert Ames. And if any of you have read The Good Spy, you realize it's a whole biography about this clandestine CIA officer. And he was my next door neighbor. He's a very handsome 6'2" American from Philadelphia, married to a beautiful blonde woman who looked like Liv Ullmann, the famous movie actress. Bob used to play basketball all the time across the street. And I thought he was a Foreign Service officer like my father, a regular diplomat. And then in the newspapers one day in 1983, I read that this truck bomb had been driven into the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, there on the Corniche, just below AUB. And it had exploded with enormous force and brought down most of the building. And Bob Ames, happened to be in the embassy that day. He had flown in from Washington a day earlier, and he was killed. And I read that he was a CIA officer, and that was the first time I realized that he was CIA, not regular State Department Foreign Service. So I was always curious about his story. How did he come to be killed? What was he doing in the Middle East all those years as a CIA clandestine officer? And I initially got into the story, and this is important for you to understand, how books come to be written. It's not a clear process. It's, a series of accidents. Initially, I thought there was no way I could do a real biography. He's a spy, and no one's going to talk to me. His employer, the CIA, isn't going to give me any records. And so I thought, maybe I could just do a book about the embassy attack and how it came about and who was killed and how and why. And so I began to dig into that. And at one point, though, I discovered that there were court transcripts, and that the survivors of the Beirut embassy attack and some of the relatives of the people killed had filed a suit. They were a civil suit in Washington, D.C., suing the Islamic Republic of Iran. And I could go online and find the court records and all the testimony. And, it was incredible. There online was the court testimony of Yvonne Ames, the widow of Bob Ames, who had been my next door neighbor. I remembered her very well. And it was very dramatic testimony. And so I discovered that she was still alive and living in North Carolina in a small town. And I tracked her down and paid her a visit and spent a weekend with her. And she told me all these stories about her relationship with Bob Ames and what had happened, the tragedy of learning one morning that her husband had been killed. And then at one point she said, there may be some letters that Bob wrote to me. I think there's a suitcase in the attic of my daughter. And I said, well, I'd love to see those letters. And indeed, 6 months later, it took a while for her to find them. She found this suitcase and opened it up, and there were these letters that Bob Ames had written to her 30, 40 years ago. And there were 150 pages of handwritten, intimate love letters, but letters also that described Ames's sort of daily life as a CIA officer and his meetings he was having with people. I mean, it was a treasure trove, and those letters allowed me to actually write a deeply intimate biography of Robert Ames.
Ames was very sympathetic to the Palestinians and was the CIA's link to the PLO. How did his view of the Palestinians evolve?
Yeah, he, as a young man, he'd been drafted into the U.S. Army and stationed in Ethiopia in a listening post called Kagnu Station up in the mountains. And there he heard for the first time Arabic, and he liked the sound of the language. He was attracted to it. And he just, as a private in the U.S. Army, he, sitting in the middle of Ethiopia, he started to teach himself Arabic. And then, he eventually went back to Philadelphia, met Yvonne, married, and in 1960 he applied on a whim to be employed by the CIA, and they accepted him. And as a young officer in 1960, at the height of the Cold War, most of these, most ambitious young CIA officers would apply to study Russian or some other Eastern European language because they would want to be at the heart of the Cold War conflict that would be with Russia, Soviet Union. But Ames, because of his experience studying Arabic on his own in Ethiopia, he applied to study Arabic and to learn about the Middle East. And he became, in the next few years, one of the agency's most qualified Arabic linguists. And he was posted to Saudi Arabia, where I met him as a young boy. And then he was stationed in Yemen and Beirut and Iran for a bit. And anyway, in 1969, and this is the sort of at the heart of the story, I was trying to figure out what was Ames. He died in 1983. He joined the agency in 1960. It was, 23 years. So what was the significance of his work as a clandestine CIA officer? Well, in 1969, just a few blocks from where you all are sitting, he was walking down Hamra Street, and arranged to have a walk-by meeting at the Strand Cafe, literally. And he was supposed to be sitting at a table on the sidewalk of the Strand Cafe, and Ali Hassan Salameh was supposed to walk by and just nod his head in recognition. And Ali Hassan Salameh, Ames knew, was Yasser Arafat's personal bodyguard and head of Force 17, and essentially his chief intelligence officer. And Ames had been able to set up this sort of clandestine initial meeting through a cutout, through a not an agent, but an asset, as they call it, a young man named Mustafa Zain, whom he had befriended in Beirut. And Mustafa Zain was a Shia Lebanese businessman who was sympathetic to the Palestinians and was a friend of Ali Hassan Salameh. And Mustafa told Ames he was ready to set up a meeting. And this is the first meeting between Ames and an official of the PLO. And it was, very significant because in 1969, regular Foreign Service officers like my father were forbidden from talking to the PLO. So the American ambassador in Beirut or Cairo would have no dealings with any members of the PLO. They were regarded as, a terrorist organization we wouldn't recognize. But of course, Arafat and the PLO were significant players in 1969, and Ames, as a CIA officer, he could go where a regular diplomat could not, and he thought it would be advantageous to open sort of a back channel between himself and the Beirut embassy and the PLO, and he tried to do it through cultivating Ali Hassan Salameh. And this first meeting led to a series of clandestine meetings in Beirut, in various safe houses, cafes, and initially, Ames was trying to recruit. He was trying to recruit Ali Hassan Salameh, turn him into a paid agent. That's what the CIA attempts to do. They want people to sign a contract and take money for providing information, not necessarily secret information, but just, to be an asset, to inform the agency about what was going on. Well, Ali Hassan Salameh made it very clear in his early meetings with Ames that he was not interested in becoming a paid informant. And but Ames persisted, and he sort of turned it into a real friendship. And this friendship survived for 10 years. And that's the heart of the story in The Good Spy. It's a 10-year friendship that leads to serious conversations about the nature of the conflict. And Ames it was a two-way street. I mean, Ames was trying to influence Ali Hassan Salameh and Arafat by trying to push them to think about achieving Palestinian goals through political means, not through the gun, not through armed struggle. And Ali Hassan Salameh was a very smart, charismatic young man who spoke several languages, had studied in Germany, and he realized that at some point, he was persuaded by Ames's argument that at some point the Palestinians were going to have to lay down the gun and start talking to the Israelis and start talking about a political solution. And so Ali Hassan was influencing Arafat. And, in 1974, Arafat began to talk among his colleagues about what a political solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict would look like. So this was, I think, a direct influence of Ames's outreach to Ali Hassan Salameh.
Who you want to question?
Hi, my name is Mana Mukallid. I'm a first year MedLab student, and I wanted to ask you, you present a humanistic approach of this conflict in the Middle East. Do you believe that Ames' approach would work in today's intelligence world?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question. Do I believe?
No.
Do you believe Ames' approach, the humanistic, would work in today's intelligence world?
The sound is not very good. I still didn't understand the question.
Okay.
Question.
Do you believe Ames' approach would work in today's intelligence world?
That Ames's approach to Reagan?
No,
Like
would Ames's method of working with Abu Hassan, for example, work today?
Would it work today?
Right.
Yeah, sure. I think these kinds of backdoor, back channel conversations happen all the time, or they should. But you know, the Ames was, even at the time in 1969, while he knew what he was doing was a good thing to try to create this back channel, he was very frustrated that he felt that what he was reporting back to Washington, to the policymakers, was not being listened to. And this is an old problem in the world of intelligence. You know, you can have the best intelligence, the best access, the most detailed information about a conflict, an issue abroad, and the policymakers in Washington they don't listen. They don't read. They listen to their own echo chamber, and they are influenced more by the political considerations, domestic, inside America, than the intelligence that they're learning from Ames. So Ames was very frustrated that he was not being listened to, and that his information about the PLO was not being taken into account. So this is a theme of another theme of the book, The Good Spy. It's that this was what happened in this relationship in 10 years was an enormous missed opportunity. That what Ames was doing was creating this possibility for negotiations, talk, and a political settlement. And the policymakers, the president, the State Department, the Secretary of State, should have taken advantage of this to push Arafat to make deals, to persuade him that he could be rewarded for taking steps towards a political solution, and likewise put pressure on the Israelis to negotiate. And none of that happened. And yet, looking back on it, it's clear that what Ames did in the 70s sort of laid the ground for the Oslo peace process in the early 90s. And of course, by that time, he was dead. So was Ali Hassan Salameh. But I argue in the book that what happened in Oslo in the early 90s could have happened in the late 70s. And if it had, we'd be in a very different place today.
Another question, please.
Hello, doctor. My name is Zainab Al-Husseini. I'm a senior psychology student. So you wrote that Ames understood the Palestinian story in a way few Americans ever had. At a time when Palestinians were framed as security risks rather than political actors, Ames was able to build trust with them. Why did the U.S. intelligence community struggle to view Palestinian leaders as partners?
Well, I think the answer to that is domestic political politics. You know, uh, the the president and on down, senators and congressmen, they listen to their political constituency at home, and however much they might learn about the internal politics of the Middle East, they're they're uh, they're going to act and make decisions based on their domestic political constituency. And you know, there's not much understanding among most American voters about the Middle East, about Palestinians, about Israel. So again, it's this frustration that Ames felt at not being able to use the information, the influence that he was exerting on Arafat and Ali Hassan Salameh. So it's a tragedy.
Question.
Hello, my name is Leah Murad, and I'm a senior computer science student. And so my question goes back to something you said, how Robert Ames was able to build a friendship with Ali Hassan Salameh, was able to build an unusual trust that many Americans couldn't. So in your research, what was it about Ames that allowed him to build this relationship with Ali Hassan Salameh? And what was it about Salameh that was open to having this relationship with Ames?
Well, Ames was just, he was the kind of young man who was curious about others. You know, he took the trouble to learn Arabic. And for an English speaker, that's a very arduous language to learn. He was curious about Arab society and culture. You know, when people came to his apartment, it was strewn with books. And this you would think this would be true of all CIA officers or Foreign Service officers, but it's not. In fact, in the book, at one point I recount a conversation that Ames had with one of his bosses in Langley at the CIA headquarters, where they were making fun of him for spending all this time learning the language and the culture and the history. And his boss said, "Oh, any information worth learning can be gotten from someone who speaks English." It's like, you know, there's a real ignorance at play. But Ames was unusual, and this is an important point in the sort of the history of the CIA. In I think today the agency is enamored with electronic intelligence. You know, the fact that they can intercept conversations on your cell phone or wiretaps, and they're less interested in what's called human intelligence. But human intelligence that's the only way you sort of get at the question of intentions. What is your adversary or your enemy thinking? What is their intention? How do they see the world? Well, you can't learn that from electronic intelligence. You need to learn it from the very painstaking cultivation of personal relationships and trust. Essentially, you need to create friendships, and that's what a good intelligence officer should be doing. So, but that's not what is invested in most intelligence bureaucracies. I think that was a long-winded answer to your question, but
Thank you.
Yes, we have to stand with it.
Hi, my name is Leila Nuruddin. I'm a senior psychology major, and I just want to say thank you for your time. You already touched on this, but you write that Ames was one of the first U.S. officials to take the Palestinian cause seriously. So, what do you think, in your opinion, allowed Ames to see Palestinian political legitimacy early when so many in the U.S. national security resisted that idea?
I'm sorry, why did they resist his?
No, why? What allowed him to see Palestinian political legitimacy when they resisted that?
Well, I think it was his conversations with Ali Hassan Salameh. They became good friends. He would come over to Ali Hassan's apartment and have elaborate meals together. And he played with Ali Hassan's children. And when Ali Hassan began this relationship with Miss Universe, Miss Lebanon, who her name was Rizik. He tried to persuade Ali Hassan to not marry this woman, not take on a second marriage. The relationship was very intimate and one-on-one. They were friends, and they could, like good friends, they could try to give each other advice, sometimes hard advice. So Ames was just, he had a personality that was open to the other, to foreign experiences, and he was, desperate to convey his knowledge back to Washington, and very frustrated that no one seemed to be listening.
Yeah, my second question, which you also touched on a bit, do you believe Ames' diplomacy could have changed the trajectory of the conflict if it had been supported institutionally?
Well, my short answer would be yes, but sure, it's very complicated, and I'm arguing, what historians call a counterfactual. I'm saying what didn't happen might well have happened if people had done something differently. And as an historian, journalist, I believe that human beings have agency. Things are not set in history. What you know from history needn't have happened that way. Things could have gone a different direction. And that's very true of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. There were Palestinians and Israelis on both sides in the 1970s who understood that someday they were all going to have to live in this region, and that meant that they should be talking to each other and learning about each other. But the extremists, they won the game as such, and the extremists today are, particularly on the Israeli side, are in charge, and so the conflict goes on and on.
Another question. Maybe from this side of the room.
Hello, my name is Marcel Shaya. I'm a third-year economics student. My question is, you portray Ames as someone who truly saw the Arab world. To which level do you think American foreign policy still suffers from the same cultural blind spots he tried to correct at the time?
Well, you all are asking me the same question in one way or another, but again, I think over the years, the American diplomats and CIA officers and journalists who have lived and reported on the region have repeatedly, again and again, conveyed, a deep knowledge about what was going on. But, in America, it's very interesting. You pick up the newspaper or you turn on the television news, and almost every day, certainly every week, you get little news from the Middle East. I opened my iPhone this morning and I read that Israel has killed 100 more Palestinians in Gaza. We hear about it every day. And you'd think that American citizens, readers of the news, would want to also then pick up a book and try to understand in more depth about the conflict. But it is an old story that books written by historians and journalists about the Middle East, they don't sell. They sell very poorly. And this has always been a surprise to me, because I know our citizens are reading about the Middle East on a daily basis, and yet it's like they see those headlines and they know it's all bad news, and it's too complicated, and so they shy away from picking up a book. So it's very frustrating to figure out how to break through and convey a deeper knowledge of. But my memoir about the Middle East, Crossing Mandelbaum Gate, was published in 2010. It lost a lot of money for my publisher. I think they sold maybe less than 10,000 copies. And then when the Gaza war started 2 years ago, about 6 months into the conflict, I got a call, and my editor at that publishing house wanted to reprint Crossing Mandelbaum Gate and bring it out again. And he asked me to write a new introduction. And so I was, for a moment, excited that, they're going to find a way to find an audience for this book. They published a new edition with the new introduction. I think it's sold a few hundred copies. It's, and here we're 2 years into this Gaza war, and that little book actually explains a lot of the history, but people don't, very few people care to pick it up and buy it. The Good Spy, by contrast, just as a little aside, it was published in 2014, so it's 11 years ago. And over the years, it's actually done better. It's sold about 65,000 copies. And I think that's because it has the word spy in the title, and people like reading about spies.
Just a follow-up. I just have a follow-up question. So what do you think might be a solution with these blind spots and people being uninterested in learning about this kind of history?
Well, I think things have to change dramatically. We have to have, real leadership. You need to have people willing to take political risks in this country and saying, enough of this. We need to we need to have a political change of regime as such. But I have to say that there's also, there is some cause for optimism in that, particularly in the last 2 years during the Gaza war, it's shocking, the headlines. It's shocking, the war crimes that have been committed. And this has actually begun to make a difference. It's changed people's minds, particularly in the Jewish American community. There are organizations in the Jewish American community that are stuck in the past, like AIPAC, but there's also J Street, which is a sort of liberal Jewish American group that tries to educate people about the conflict and the need for two-state solution, some kind of solution, any solution other than what we've got today. And, people are talking about the war crimes that Israel has committed. And, we have a young man in New York City, where I am now, who's running for mayor, who is now openly saying, if Bibi Netanyahu arrives in New York City, I will order my police to arrest him and send him to The Hague, where he's under indictment for crimes against humanity, right? Now, he doesn't have the power to do that, but it's extraordinary that someone running for the mayor of New York City is willing to say that.
Yeah. Thank you. Another question? Yes, please.
Hello, Mr. Kai. Let me start first thanking you for your time. It's a great pleasure to have you here. My name is Safwan Bakr Ananza. I'm a senior media, and I'm from Jordan. And I was actually being investigated by the Jordanian intelligence agency last weekend, which made me think about in your book, The Good Spy, you talked about Robert Ames' time in Jordan during Black September. So I wanted to ask, do you think the crisis in Black September is what made Jordan intelligence agency very much strong and trusted nowadays? And my follow-up question is, how do you describe the CIA relation with the Jordanian intelligence comparing to CIA relations with other Arab countries' agencies?
Okay. Well, as the 1970s, September 1970 civil war in Jordan was a real turning point, a tipping point. It was a majority of the population of Jordan then and today are of Palestinian ancestry. And yet, as you know, the political establishment is controlled by the Hashemites, who came historically from Arabia. And it's a political imbalance that Arafat in 1970 was attempting to correct. And his revolt against King Hussein as such was, a serious challenge to the Hashemite establishment. They almost won. And, this is again is a sort of historical counterfactual. What would have happened if Arafat had won the civil war and the Palestinians had taken control of Jordan? Well, we would have been in a very different place. That would have been the beginning of, quote, a two-state solution. And the political dynamics of the whole Palestinian-Israeli conflict would be very different. But what happened was there was an intense debate inside the Israeli cabinet, inside Israel, but also in America, where people like Robert Ames was sending back reports that the U.S. should stand aside and allow the King Hussein's regime to collapse. And that advice was rejected in Washington. But interestingly enough, even more importantly, there was a real debate inside the Israeli cabinet about whether to allow King Hussein to fall or whether they should come to his aid. And ironically enough, General Ariel Sharon took the argument that we should allow the PLO to prevail. And you know, things would have, I argue, things would have been very different. But the Israeli political establishment and intelligence apparatus and the American intelligence apparatus, and through their support behind King Hussein, and allowed him to prevail in what was a very close call, actually. So again, things could have gone differently.
Nobody has a question?
Sir Kai, I wanted to thank you for being with us today. I'm Maya Aziz. I'm a junior psychology major, and my question is, I want to ask, did the CIA see the PLO as a nationalist movement to be negotiated with, or did they just purely see it as a terrorist organization?
I didn't get that question. I'm sorry.
Did the CIA see the PLO as a nationalist movement, or did that they could negotiate with, or did they purely see it as a terrorist organization?
Yeah. Well, Robert Ames saw it as a political movement. And I think most CIA analysts understood that too. But the PLO in the late 60s and 70s was engaged in armed struggle. And, you know, so they were using guns and terrorism as such. Well, you know, we all understand that terrorism, you know, attacks on civilians or attacks on, you know, planting bombs in marketplaces. These are the weapons of weak actors, people who are on the defensive, who have no power against the state, right? And they, as we learned from Frantz Fanon and his studies of the Algerian Revolution, you know, terrorism is used to try to provoke the state to overreact and to engage in crimes that then mobilize public opinion against the state powers. So this is exactly what Hamas did in Gaza. They committed what, you know, objectively speaking, were war crimes in the kibbutzes along the border with Gaza and killed innocent civilians. To provoke, knowing that this would provoke the Israeli state to commit horrible war crimes themselves, 10 times worse in Gaza, and that this would change somehow the political dynamics. Well, you know, Ames understood that too. And as I relate in the book, in 1972, you know, when he was engaged in this cultivation of a friendship with Ali Hassan Salameh, in 1972, the Black September organization, which was a clandestine part of Arafat's organization, Al-Fatah, organized this spectacular attack at the Olympics in Munich. And 11 Israeli athletes were taken hostage and then killed. And, you know, it was a it was a public relations disaster for the Palestinians, but it was an attempt to get the Israelis to react and an attempt to gain the world's attention. And Ames was appalled. You know, he wondered whether Ali Hassan Salameh was himself personally involved in the Munich attack. And he investigated this. But he convinced himself that the evidence was actually that Salameh had an argument with Arafat and other factions within Fatah, and he'd been put on leave, and he'd actually had nothing to do with the Munich operation. So Ames convinced himself that it was okay to try to continue the relationship. And likewise, around the same, soon afterwards, there was an incident in Khartoum where Black September again took hostages, and the American ambassador there was assassinated. And again, Ames wondered whether he could continue this relationship with Salameh, but he took a risk. It was really on his own authority. He didn't really take permission from his bosses back in Langley. And he took another meeting with Ali Hassan Salameh and negotiated. He got a promise that American diplomats would henceforth not be targeted in any of these, quote, operations. And that was, again, a step forward in the relationship. So, it's complicated, isn't it? Ames was taking enormous risks as a clandestine CIA officer, even taking meetings with Salameh. And his bosses back in Langley kept complaining, well, you've got this interesting back channel relationship, but why can't you just, make the deal and recruit him as a paid asset? And of course, that was never going to happen. Ames knew that wasn't going to happen, but he nevertheless thought that the friendship was enormously valuable.
I'd like to ask a question. Going back to Black September 1970, Palestinian armed resistance is expelled from Jordan, came here to Lebanon, and begins to conduct its armed struggle and its international terrorist campaign out of Beirut. Was its obvious failure, the failure of the armed struggle, one of the reasons that Arafat, Abu Hassan wanted to have a possible diplomatic way out, because the armed struggle really wasn't going anywhere?
Oh, I think so. I think when Arafat started Fatah back in 1965, it was the hope was that by taking up the gun, that he could galvanize Palestinian resistance, and shock the Israeli populace into realizing that the Palestinians weren't going anywhere and that they had to deal. But Arafat, he engaged in armed struggle, and of course, after the defeat, I think this is the real turning point. After the defeat in Jordan, it was clear that they had gone as far as they could with the gun, and they had been defeated in Jordan. The forces arrayed against the Palestinian militias were just too much, and the Jordanian tanks and Israeli air power, and it was clear that the Hashemites and the Israelis were not going to allow the Palestinians to prevail in armed struggle. They weren't allowed to take over the state of Jordan. So they moved to Beirut, and then it becomes a move towards the inevitability, I would argue, of a political solution, of compromise. But Arafat had his own internal politics. The PLO was a coalition, and there were hardliners and softliners and realists and extremists, and there was Abu Nidal, who was out there targeting Palestinians. So Arafat had a very delicate position. He was vulnerable himself. If he went too far too quickly in the direction of a political solution, he could be assassinated. And then there was, the fact of what happened to Ali Hassan Salameh. We haven't talked about that, but in 1979, Robert Ames and several other CIA officers repeatedly warned Salameh that they had hard information that the Israelis, that Mossad was out to assassinate Salameh. And this is an old story. The Israelis have repeatedly assassinated or imprisoned or exiled any Palestinian leaders that showed promise of being charismatic and moderate and offering a political solution. So here, Ali Hassan Salameh is, the Israelis know that he is the back channel to the CIA, and they planned repeatedly, not once, but they repeatedly tried to kill him. And Ames specifically gave him a hard warning that there was new information that Mossad was mounting an operation to assassinate him in January of '79. And in the book, it's quite interesting. It's extraordinary that I was able to get this information, but it's clear that the CIA provided the warnings and that there was a debate inside Mossad about whether they should be targeting Ali Hassan. The hardliners were arguing that he was responsible, among others, for Munich. And that was the excuse for killing him. But the real reason, I think it's quite clear, the real reason was that Mossad had made the decision that, and the political leadership in Israel had made the decision that Ali Hassan was a real threat precisely because he had this back channel to the CIA and he was influencing Arafat through the CIA to have a political solution. And they didn't want that. So it's a tragic, again, missed opportunity.
Any other questions?
I have a question.
Oh, good.
Hi, my name is Yasmina Halawi and I'm a third year nursing student. Okay. Were there ethical dilemmas you faced while learning about the CBTI PLO contacts?
I didn't get that again.
Sure.
Were there ethical dilemmas you faced while writing about the CBTI PLO contacts?
Charlie, can you?
If he had it himself as a writer,
He faced
if
ethical dilemmas.
you had any moral dilemma about writing about this relationship,
Yeah.
correct? That's the question. You yourself as a writer had any moral qualms about writing about this relationship?
Do I have a moral dilemma about writing
Yes.
about this? I see.
No point until.
I don't think, I just found it a fascinating story. That that it's not black and white, that there were good and bad intentions on both sides. And it's a classic story in the world of intelligence where you're supposed to be trying to create channels, develop information about an enemy, an adversary, and yet part of the if you're going to be able to successfully do that, you have to create trust. So coming back to the assassination story of Ali Hassan, it does create a moral dilemma. Here, Ames comes into information from his Mossad contacts that Ali Hassan may be targeted. So his dilemma is, Israelis are asking him point blank, is Ali Hassan your man? Is he signed up as a paid agent? And, you know, Ames would have to say no, because Ali Hassan was not a paid asset. But if he lied and he said to the Israelis, yes, he's my man, the next question was going to be, the Israelis, Mossad would say, then if he's your man, we want all the information, all the intelligence that he's providing you. You're our ally and we share information, so you've got to share what Ali Hassan has been saying. And if that were to happen, Ames would realize that that would put Ali Hassan in at personal risk from his own colleagues. So who would begin to suspect that Ali Hassan was an agent of the CIA and therefore a collaborator with the Israelis, and that would make him vulnerable to assassination by his Palestinian colleagues. So Ames was in a very, was facing a moral quandary, a dilemma. How can he protect Ali Hassan? And he decided that the best thing to do was to tell the Israelis, no, he's not our man, and we can't share what he's telling us in the way of intelligence. And then to warn Ali Hassan that he should take precautions to protect himself because he was going to be targeted by Mossad. And then, that was a moral quandary, and it didn't work out. And Ames was shocked to learn one day that a car bomb attack in the streets of Beirut had successfully killed Ali Hassan, and he was personally, emotionally distraught.
As far as you know, what was the reaction first of the CIA and second of Palestinians to your book?
Oh. Well, I should say that when I started out and decided that I could actually do a biography of Ames, I went to the CIA Public Affairs Director. I got a meeting in Langley, and I spent an hour with this guy, and I explained to him that, I was doing a biography essentially about one of their heroes, a man who was, when he was killed, CIA has a wall in the headquarters and the lobby with a star for each of their officers who has been killed in the line of duty. And, there's a star there for Robert Ames. I said, I realize you can't give me much, but can you give me just, the outlines of his personnel record, dates of where he was stationed and when, and his job titles over the years, and just very basic information. And the director of public relations said, "Oh yes, this sounds like a great idea. I understand. I'll get back to you." I never heard from the guy. But when I had this interview with Yvonne Ames, she gave me the names of several of her late husband's colleagues who were by then retired. And I tracked them down, and these were retired CIA officers who had signed secrecy oaths not to ever divulge or talk about their work. But, these men were by then, when I talked to them, they were in their 70s, 80s. And they admired Ames, and they, mourned his death, and they wanted to tell their story. So some of them talked to me on the record using their own names. I talked to about 40 CIA officers who did this, and some of them I had to protect with aliases, and so that their names appear with a pseudonym. Anyway, when the book came out, it was quite extraordinary. I attended a conference of retired CIA, retired intelligence officers in Washington, D.C. And they gave me a platform, and I got up and talked for 40 minutes about the book. And, I got a standing ovation afterwards, and people came up to me and said, what a great book it was. And I think so. That's kind of extraordinary. And then on the other side, The Good Spy has been translated into Arabic and published in Beirut. And I understand that it's available to this day in Beirut bookstores. And I think the Palestinian community has regarded it as a sympathetic account. So that's sort of been heartening that I was able to write a book that pleased both the CIA and the Palestinian community.
What about the Israeli reaction?
That's interesting. The Israelis were, I think they were astonished by the tale, and the book has not been translated into Hebrew. And I did go to Israel to do research, and I tracked down. I think I interviewed 4 retired Mossad operatives, and I got them to talk to me. And at one point, I was talking to actually a former head of chief of Mossad, then retired, and I was telling him what I had learned about Ali Hassan Salameh, and he stopped me at one point in the interview and said, "Now wait a minute. Is your government really going to allow you to publish all this secret information?" I said, "Well, it's not up to my government to decide what I can publish." But he was astonished that this story could be, that I had learned so much from both sides, actually. Anyway, I don't think the Israeli, the book Good Spy has not found an audience of readers in Israel, but it's available in English language editions in English language bookstores in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. So.
The American Colony Bookshop?
Yes, right.
Kai, thank you very much for doing this for us today. It's been very enlightening for all of us.
Well, as you can see, Charlie, I loved writing this book, and I love talking about it. I'm very proud of it. I think it provides a deep insight into both the conflict and the sort of the nature of the intelligence business. And it took me 4 years to write it, and I'm very grateful for you providing me a platform to go on and on talking about it.
I hope it'll lead to more sales.
Yeah, right.
Good luck. Thank you very much.
We're actually hoping someday that a film will be made. Hollywood actually, there is a film option and there is a script written, but it's not very good. And the guys who tried to do this have sort of given up. But I'm hopeful that someday it could make it to the big screen.
Development, it should.
Right.
Thank
All
you
right.
again.